Recorded. Okay, so now we're ready to begin, and so we'll start with the verse of salutation to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Homage to him, the Blessed One, the Worthy One, the fully enlightened one. Okay, so good morning, everybody. And today is July 29th. So we are well into the summer of 2023 now. And we'll be continuing now with our reading of the Numerical Discourses, the Anguttara Nikaya, Book of Fives. And today we come to a very practical, very useful sutta. It's spoken by the Buddha's chief disciple, Venerable Sariputta. And it's about a situation, though the Sariputta is formulating this in the way one monk should reprove or criticize another. But this has applications, I think, to all of us in our everyday life, whether at work, in the family, in our community, with our friends. Situations arise where it becomes almost necessary, we could say, to criticize somebody else. The word used here in the sutta is translated as reprove. If I remember, the Pali word is chodati. So this is to criticize, but to criticize not on intellectual grounds, but to criticize somebody on the basis of their behavior. And it implies that there is the underlying intention of correcting them, trying to redirect them from call this an unwholesome course of action towards wholesome behavior, from a harmful course of action towards beneficial behavior. And so Sariputta here is speaking about first how one who wishes to reprove another, to reproach another, to correct another, should first establish 5 things within himself, or in the case of a woman, within herself. So sort of our natural tendency when we see somebody doing something wrong, something disagreeable, is just to act from immediate impulse, to speak up without reflection, without consideration. And just sometimes we are overcome by anger and by resentment and by sometimes even a kind of moral self-righteousness. And so we start criticizing another person, saying, you shouldn't do this, you should do it that way. But here, Sariputta, sort of following the instructions that have come down elsewhere from the Buddha, points out the emphasis or emphasizes that one first has to pause for a moment and ensure that one has established 5 things within oneself. So this, in a way, sort of the instrumental factor that plays into this here, we could say 2 factors working together would be our old friends. What are those old friends of ours? In Pali, we call them mindfulness, or in English, we call them mindfulness and clear comprehension. In Pali, sati and sampajanya. Yeah, sati and sampajanya. So mindfulness is that moment in which we pause, and instead of acting spontaneously on immediate impulse, we just pause and collect our mind, settle our mind in the expectation that we want to speak up, that we are on the verge of speaking up. So we just pause for that moment. In that pause, one can maybe focus the attention on the breath, on the body, and then one applies sampajanya, clear comprehension, in order to make sure that in speaking, you're meeting these 5 criteria that are going to be laid down. Okay, so what are the 5 criteria? The first is that when you speak to the other person to correct them, to criticize them for their faults, you're speaking at a proper time, not at an improper time. Okay, so what is an improper time? Okay, the person that you want to speak to, that you see that they're doing things wrong and you want to correct them. You see that they're sitting in the circle of their friends having a chat, and you come over and then you start criticizing them and saying, you did that wrongly. You misplaced this. And so if you speak to them when they're sitting with their friends, what is going to be the result? What will be the outcome of that?
They're going to be angry. They're not going to listen to you.
Yeah, they'll be angry, and not only angry, what else?
Defensive. They'll probably be defensive.
Yeah, the first thing that occurs to me, imagine you're sitting with your friends and then somebody comes over to you and points out that you've done something wrong.
Embarrassed.
Embarrassment.
Right.
You'd be humiliated.
That was the word that I wanted, humiliation. You feel humiliated in front of your friends. You feel like you want to maybe crawl into a hole. And then when you have to, especially if the person's criticism is genuine, authentic, if it's valid, then you feel just so hurt and humiliated that you can't even face your friends again. Okay, so the proper time to speak to somebody, at least one of the criteria, is when they're alone. Okay, another proper time, what would be another wrong time and a proper time? Any ideas?
When they're in danger.
Say again?
When they're in danger.
In danger. I wasn't quite thinking of that. Do you want to say exactly what you mean by that? Forgive me.
I guess when someone makes a mistake and I don't know, maybe cause an accident or cause.
Well, if they're going to cause an accident, that would be the proper time to speak to them, to prevent them from causing an accident.
Bhante, when they're giving a Dharma talk or something like that, or speaking to an audience.
Yeah, that's a good example. It wasn't what I was thinking of, but in a way that's a little bit similar to speaking to them when they're in the midst, in their circle of their friends.
When they're calm.
Excuse me?
When they're calm and happy and in a good mood and not in.
Yeah, that is the proper time, but we want to find the improper time.
When the person is when the person is angry.
Sad.
Actually, that's a good idea. When the person is sad, you don't want to speak to them. If you see from their facial gestures, their body language, or other indications that they're sad, feeling melancholy, you don't want to speak to them because that's going to pull them down further. But I was thinking of another very simple situation. The person is very busy, they're engaged in some activity which seems to be critically important and they have to meet a certain deadline, finish on time. And so you don't want to interrupt them and start speaking to them on that occasion. But you find a time when they're alone, when they seem to be in a good mood, when they're relaxed, and you're not engaged in anything that demands their full attention, and not when they're giving a Dhamma talk. So that sometimes happens, somebody will stand up and criticize a person who's giving a Dhamma talk right in front of them, and that can be humiliating for the speaker. Yeah, I had that, I think I mentioned this a few weeks ago, that I had that experience myself in California in May. It was not a formal Dhamma talk, but it's a Q&A session, and I gave an answer to a question. And then somebody came in the back of the hall, stood up and said, "What right do you have to impose your views on the entire Sangha?" And I wasn't imposing my views on the Sangha, I was just speaking my own opinion. But it made me feel a little bit humiliated. Though I came to realize later that sometimes it's sometimes it's good to be challenged in that way. Though it should be on the part of the person who's challenging you, it should be done skillfully. Okay, so anyway, we have some idea of the proper time and the proper time for reproaching somebody and the improper time. So we want to get the person when they're alone, when they're not extremely busy, when they are not in a sad mood, an angry mood, an aggressive mood. You don't want to speak to them when they seem to be on the point of exploding with anger, because then you can become the target of their anger. Okay, then we come to the second factor, and this you have to consider. I will speak truthfully, not falsely. So you have to consider when you're going to criticize somebody, whether the criticism that you're going to be making is a valid criticism, whether there are substantial grounds that support that criticism. And this is an interesting observation that we can make about the Buddha's method of criticizing somebody. And I have to say, I have to backtrack a little bit on saying that one shouldn't criticize somebody in front of a group, because the Buddha often does this. But I think this is the reason why he does that is because he wants his message to be conveyed to the entire Sangha, the monastic community. So if a monk is misbehaving, the Buddha will call that monk up, and in front of all the other monks, he'll criticize that person. And even though the person does feel humiliated, you see that there's a stock description. We find this, let's see, in Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 22, and again in the Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 38, where the monks have been advocating distorted presentations of the Buddha's teaching. In one case, the monk named Arita, has been saying that for an ordained person, a monastic, there's no obstacle, no reason why they shouldn't fully engage in sensual pleasures. In the other sutta, number 38, the monk has been advocating the view that there is a self that migrates from life to life. So in the one case, the monk Arita has been sort of opening the floodgates to full indulgence in sensual pleasures and sensual craving. In the other case, number 38, the monk named Sati has been opening the door to a view of self. And in both cases, the Buddha calls that monk up in front of the Sangha and criticizes them. And then this text says that the Venerable so-and-so then sat there with his face cast down, his shoulders slumped, sort of scratching the ground with his fingers, feeling upset But the Buddha does this because it's important for him in front of all of the other monks to point out the correct interpretation of the teaching. But this is a point I wanted to make. When the Buddha is going to criticize one of the monks, he'll ask somebody, please call the Venerable so-and-so, bring them in front of me. Then even though the Buddha has heard from trustworthy sources, maybe from various other monks, he's heard complaints about the behavior of this monk or about the views of that monk, the Buddha doesn't immediately launch into a criticism of them, but he'll always begin by saying, is it true that you have been speaking in this way? Or is it true that you engaged in such and such a kind of misbehavior? So before the Buddha reproaches the misbehaving monk, he asks the monk to his face whether these reports that he has heard about that monk, about their conduct, about their views, whether that report is true. And of course, a monk or anybody else who's called up in front of the Buddha would not speak falsely and try to camouflage their misbehavior or justify themselves in front of the Buddha, because I guess the presence of the Buddha is just so powerful that they would have to admit, Evang Bhante, it's true, so it is, Bhante. Okay, so when you want to criticize somebody, first have to be sure that the ground of criticism is valid, that it's true. You don't want to start blaming somebody on false grounds, just on the basis of rumor or your own speculation, your own interpretation. Because we all, as ordinary human beings, we could come to judgments based on wrong behavior or on wrong perception. Yeah, there's a story that just came to my mind. It's a story that comes in the Vinaya, the monastic discipline. You see, there was a group of monks that are called the group of 6 monks, and these are monks who frequently behave in various ways. And in the Vinaya, I don't know whether they were real historical persons or whether they are kind of paper tiger that the Vinaya has set up as a means for explaining the background to a number of rules. But in any case, there was a good monk, a monk who was an arahant, who assigned these 6 monks to a particular meal. Yeah, the good monk, Dabba the Mala, was an arhat, and he took on the position of being the assigner of meals. So when it comes time to assign other monks to go out for house offerings, when people in the household want to offer a meal to the monks, this monk Dabba the Mala had the responsibility of issuing those assignments. And so on one occasion, Dabba the Mala assigned the group of 6 monks to a house for the meal, and the householder knew that those monks were misbehaving monks, and so he gave them just very ordinary food. They were expecting a delicious meal, and yet they received just very ordinary plain food, maybe just rice and a little maybe green beans and some sweet potatoes, something like that. And so they were very angry with Dabba the Mala. And so they wanted to pull down into calumny, to blemish the reputation of Dabba the Mala. And so what they did was they named a goat. There was a goat that they would see on a nearby farm, and they named the goat Dabba the Mala. And then they saw that goat that they named Dabba the Mala, they saw that goat having sexual intercourse with a female goat. And so then they came back to the Sangha and they started spreading the rumor that Dabba the Mala indulged in sexual relations. And so this report then came to the Buddha, and then the Buddha called those 6 monks up in front of him, and then he asked them whether this was true or false. And then the monks had to confess that they had created this fabrication in order to blemish the reputation of Dabba the Mala. Okay, so this emphasizes the need to speak truthfully, not falsely, and not creating false pretexts the way these 6 monks, the group of 6 monks did, in order to injure the reputation of somebody. So you have to be not simply truthful, but you have to be faithful to the facts. Okay, the third criterion in criticizing or reproaching somebody is to speak gently, not harshly, especially if somebody is behaving in ways that are disagreeable to us, that are offensive to us, or that harm us in some way, that bring difficulties and trouble to us. Our immediate impulse is to lash out angrily and to speak to them harshly in ways that will hurt their feelings. And when you speak harshly to somebody, what is their normal response going to be? Will they accept your criticism? What do you think? What is the normal response?
They're going to be
Aggression.
hurt.
One person at a time.
Aggression, Bhante?
Yeah, exactly. They will retaliate in a sense.
And you're also hurting them, Bhante.
Yeah, you hurt
That's not a
their
good thing.
feelings, and then their response, the immediate response, is to lash back at you. We see this a lot within families. So I'm not a parent with children, but what happens as a parent if you see your child is misbehaving and then you say, you shouldn't be doing that. Why did you do that? What is the response of the kid going to be? Will they say, yes, mother, I'll change my ways?
They're going to say, you're not the boss of me.
Yeah. Yes.
You're not the boss
So
of me.
they will just respond. They'll be provoked, and then they will speak to you in an angry way in turn, and maybe they'll go into their room and slam the door, or they'll go out of the house and slam the door, and maybe even you won't see them for a couple of days because they're really upset with you. And so if you want to get them to change the way you speak gently, softly, politely, in a way that's going to win their affection, or let's say to strengthen the affection that they have for you. And once they feel that you are speaking to them gently, then they'll be much more inclined to accept your advice, your criticism, and change their ways. Change their ways. Okay, the fourth criterion here is to speak in a beneficial way. And I think, I don't have the Pali immediately in front of me right now. I think the Pali expression here, translated more literally, would be to speak in a way with the intention of benefiting them, not with the intention of harming them. So here you have to reflect back, what is your purpose, your intention in speaking to the other person, in trying to correct them, to criticize them, to reprove them. The intention is to benefit them. You don't want to harm them. You don't want to hurt their feelings, to humiliate them, much less to steer them into a direction that's going to be harmful to them. But you want to pull them away from the wrong type of behavior in which they're engaging and move them towards right behavior. Okay, then we have the fifth criterion. And in a way, this is the criterion that underlies all of the others, or should underlie all of the others, and that is you speak with a metta citta. That is the mind of metta or maitri, the mind of loving kindness, not with a mind of hatred. And so I think we could say that it's through the mind of the loving kindness that you'll choose the proper time to speak to the person. At least it's through the mind of loving kindness that you'll speak gently. Of course, gentle speech comes from loving kindness. And it's through loving kindness that you'll speak in a beneficial way rather than a harmful way. Whether it's truthful or false, I'd say that is not so much determined by loving kindness, but rather by, maybe here we could say that this is determined by proper discernment. You consider the different facts that are presented, and then consider whether the criticism that you're about to unleash on that person is truthful, is true, or false. Okay, so this is the sort of the initial template of the sutta. The five criteria that you should set up within yourself before you actually reproach the other person. Okay, now we'll come to the second part of the sutta, the second division. So here, and the text uses a passive voice, so it's translated in a passive voice. So you see one person being reproached by another. Please, okay, I just had to mute other people. Okay, so here in the passive voice it says, Sariputta speaking, he says he sees one person being reproved at an improper time, not disturbed at a proper time. And I sort of would reformulate this using the active voice, which makes better sense in English. So you see one person reproving another at an improper time, not at a proper time. Again, one person reproving another about what is false, speaking harshly, speaking in a harmful way, and speaking with a mind of hatred, not with loving kindness. And so in that case, Sariputta says, the monk or the person is being reproved contrary to the Dharma. And if that happens, then you should induce or arouse non-remorse in that person in 5 ways, pointing out that he was reproved at an improper time, reproved falsely, reproved harshly, reproved in a harmful way, and reproved by one motivated by hatred, not by loving kindness. And then he says, that is sufficient for you to be without remorse. But this brought up in my mind, I put a little note here. I don't know if you could read it. But my note says, what if the person what if the reproach is truthful, yet it was spoken spoken at the wrong time, spoken harshly, and so on? Should non-remorse be aroused in that person who is subject to the criticism when the criticism is truthful, not false? What do you think? Yeah, if you want to speak.
Yeah,
Okay,
can I say
Bella?
something? I mean, one thought that keeps coming to my mind, which is not in this sutta, but I recall it from somewhere, was the question, do you think it'll help? And that always pulls me back a little bit, because, you know, sometimes I think it could even be given in all these ways, but not be, the person's not going to hear it.
If it's not helpful.
Yeah, it's not helpful.
Yeah, I think that is what is indicated by this fourth criterion, that you have to, that when you criticize the other person, you have to do so speaking in a beneficial way, sort of in a way with the intention of benefiting or helping the other person.
But couldn't you do that and it still wouldn't be helpful?
I'd say if one could have the intention to benefit the other person, but one's understanding of what is beneficial might be wrong. In that case, did I lose Helen? It seems she fell off. In that, okay, you can have the intention to benefit somebody, but the way that you maybe point out, thinking that it will be beneficial, might be based or rooted in a distorted understanding on your own part, in which case the action that you recommend to the other person might not be helpful, but still your intention is to benefit the other person.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So here you have to have, I would say, a clear understanding of the situation, a clear understanding of what is truly beneficial and what appears to be beneficial but is not. It's a little bit like take a concrete example. A doctor is diagnosing a patient and he comes up with a wrong diagnosis. And so he'll give the patient a prescription for certain medicines, and the patient goes and orders those medicines and starts taking them, but the diagnosis was wrong. And so the patient won't be benefited by the medicine, maybe even harmed by the medicine. But still, you could say from evaluating the action on the part of the doctor's intention was to benefit the patient. So we can't criticize the doctor by way of their intention, but the course of action that the doctor prescribes is not the helpful one.
Thank you.
Okay, but what if, coming back to this situation, what if the reproach is truthful, yet it was spoken harshly?
Bhante, I think that in that case, the reproach should stand, but the person who is making the reproach should recognize that he could have been more skillful in delivering the reproach.
Yeah. That seems to be a good point. That that still the reproach, if it's truthful, even though it's spoken harshly, I would say that the person who's being criticized should accept the criticism, but the person who is issuing the reproach has to be, maybe either by the person being reproached or by a third person, has to be told the way you are addressing the situation is unskillful and it's harmful for you yourself because you are acting on the impulse of anger. So you have to do something to work on your anger, so that you learn to, when you want to correct somebody, to do so gently and to speak gently, not harshly. Sarah, did you have another point?
Bhante, it depends on the student. If the student or the person who is being reproached is more broad-minded, more receptive, then even receptive, then even a scolding could be considered, something valuable for that. We have, for example, many stories in the Tibetan tradition how the teacher is so cruel to the student.
How what?
Cruel, very, very cruel.
Cruel.
Yeah, you may have heard the story of Milarepa.
Yeah.
You know, how his teachers treated him.
How
the teacher treated his student.
Okay, this is the way Margaret treated Milarepa.
Yes. Okay. So it really, if the person who is receiving the rebuke has a broader, let's say, receptive, then I think even a scolding would be blessings.
Yeah. Okay. So what you're saying is that the student has to have a broader mind to be willing to accept harsh criticism that seems to be harsh.
The one who's being rebuked, yes.
Yeah, that is true. I would say also the student shouldn't always be so sensitive that any little criticism will immediately sort of trigger them and push them into a state of dejection or an angry response. But sometimes they have to be willing to accept criticism that can be sometimes pointed and caustic and a little bit sharp.
Right, Bhante. For the benefit of the students in this long term.
Yeah, that is, I'd say that's a good point. Yeah, I think the point that he's making is sometimes the criticism can be harsh and a little bit grating to the student, but the intention of the teacher is a beneficial one, is a beneficent one, wanting to help the student. And so in that way, the student has to be willing to accept sometimes sharp criticism in order to change their ways. In fact, the Buddha himself often speaks like that. You see him using the expression in Pali, moga purisa, which means, we translate it politely as foolish man. But I think in Pali it has a much stronger meaning, like, you fool. How can you go about speaking like that? Moga purisa, you empty, foolish person. Have you ever heard me, the Buddha saying, have you ever heard me teach the Dhamma in such a way? And then the Buddha says, now I'm going to question the other monks. And then the Buddha questions the other monks in a way, as sort of a way to draw them out. And each time the monks will say, Evang Bhante, or no hetang Bhante. That is not the case, that is not the case. And then that the Buddha's way of questioning leaves the monk that he's reproaching feeling really sort of upset, even miserable.
May I ask a question at this?
Yeah, let's see who is speaking.
Samangi Munasinghe. Samangi.
Okay, yeah, please.
So you are speaking to someone in a beneficial way, not in a harmful way. How about if the person who is reproving thinks it's beneficial, but it may not be beneficial, or the receiver may not view it as beneficial. For example, if somebody comes and tells me, I want to convert you to Christianity because I think it is beneficial to you, and they keep doing that and almost to a level of harassment,
Yeah, yeah.
I may not think it's beneficial, so it's the person who's reproving thinks it's beneficial,
Yeah.
but that's not the same thing I see as beneficial. So how do you square that kind of thing? Thank you.
Okay, so if the person, say the person is trying to convert you to Christianity and they're doing that from what they perceive as something that will be truly beneficial to you, that will redeem you and grant you the prospect of eternal salvation. So they're doing that with, even you could say, with a mind of loving kindness, with a mind of compassion, and they're speaking with beneficial intent. So the speech on their part, I say, would be proper speech, even though from your perspective, which is the perspective I share, that we don't want to be converted to Christianity, and so we would be
I will listen, but it could become, if it's done over and over again, it could become a harassment at that
If it becomes harassment, if one is harassing the other person, and you see that the other person, or that if the person who's trying to convert you sees that you are not amenable to listen, that you are satisfied with the religion that you already are following, and they continue to insist on converting to their religion, then that becomes, I would say, that moves over into the domain of wrong speech or wrong communication on their part.
Yeah, it could be me trying to convert somebody else. It could be the other way around too, but just as an
Yeah,
example.
I remember a time, this goes back maybe about 15 years ago, when my father was alive. I was visiting him on at his home on Long Island. Then the doorbell, somebody rings the doorbell, and I go to answer the door I'm wearing my monastic robes, and it's two women with magazines. I think it's the Watchtower is the name of the magazine, and they say, "Good afternoon, we are from Jehovah's Witnesses. May we speak to you for a few minutes?" And then I said to them, "Look, I've been a Buddhist monk now for, I think it was 40 years, 38 years, whatever. I think I'm a poor choice for you to waste your time." And then they immediately turned around. They just smiled and said, "Good day," and then they left.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, they didn't arrest me. Okay, let us move on. Okay, so this is part 2 in the sutta. So this is how you are, when the person is being reproached in any of these 5 ways, in that case, one dispels remorse in that person. But as I said, I think if the criticism is truthful, even if it's coming at the wrong time, if it's spoken harshly, even with harmful intent, spoken with hatred, still, I say that the person has to have remorse for the behavior for which they are being criticized, even though they should recognize that the speaker spoke in the wrong way. And then here, this is interesting, okay. So this is when the monk, or when one person is reproaching another in any of these ways, what's called contrary to the Dhamma, then remorse should be aroused in him in 5 ways. Okay, so if the speaker reproves another person at an improper time, okay, the speaker reproaches another at an improper time, speaks falsely, speaks harshly, speaks in a harmful way, and speaks with a mind of hatred, then the text says that the speaker or remorse should be aroused or induced in the speaker for speaking at the wrong time, for speaking harshly, for speaking falsely, for speaking harshly, for speaking in a harmful way, and while harboring hatred. And again, I raise the question, what if the speaker spoke the reproach truthfully, though at a wrong time, harshly, and so forth? In fact, I think we can maybe make a distinction here between objective grounds for the criticism, in which number 2 applies, and the subjective state of the speaker. In that case, particularly, well, number 3, 4, and 5 would apply. So the speaker speaks harshly, he speaks with harmful intent, and he speaks with hatred. You criticize somebody in that way, but the criticism is truthful.
How can it be truthful yet?
Should the speaker be made to feel remorse over that? Somebody is speaking.
I have a question. This section is when the reprover is speaking in a way contrary to the Dhamma. Yeah. How can he be not truthful if he is contrary to the Dhamma? And in those mutually exclusive, you have to be truthful in this case.
Let us just suspend this phrase contrary to the Dhamma.
Okay.
But let's just take the 5 items individually.
Mm-hmm.
Because if he's speaking, in this respect, if he's speaking truthfully, not falsely, that you could say is in accord with the Dhamma. But the other aspects of his speech would be contrary to the Dhamma. So the sutta is sort of grouping all 5 together, not explicitly bringing out the fact that there can be differences in evaluation of these factors when they're looked at individually.
So actually, it says that he's reproving in a way contrary to the Dhamma. So he could be speaking truth,
yeah,
right? But his reproving is against one of these 5 principles.
Yeah, when he's speaking at a wrong time,
yeah,
harshly, harmful way, with a mind of hatred, all of that would be contrary to the Dhamma.
But I think he should still be made to feel remorse for his method because, again, I don't know if that the truth factor overrides the other 4 factors, right? So if he's being harsh or whatever, right, he can be causing problems, even though he's speaking truthfully. That's not getting through because of his harshness, because of his improper time.
That is a good point. Yeah.
And just to add on to that point, if the intention is to really be beneficial to the person, then if you're speaking at the wrong time, not speaking with a mind of loving kindness, the person's not going to be able to hear you and take what you have to say in. And so it's likely not going to be as effective as if you were speaking at the right time, speaking with a mind of loving kindness.
Yeah, so we really have to consider what are the ways I think the key point, when you're speaking to somebody, when you're criticizing somebody, when you're reproaching them, the ultimate intention is to correct their behavior. And so you have to consider what is the effective means to change their behavior. And so you have to consider first your own intention. You have to set up the proper intention within yourself. And first, the proper attitude. So the proper attitude would be setting up the mind of loving kindness, and the intention would be the intention of benefiting the other person, to turn them away from the misbehavior and direct them towards proper behavior. So you have the attitude of loving kindness, the intention of benefiting the other person. And then the other three would sort of apply to the means, the way to induce the proper attitude or response in the other person. So if the reproach is based on false grounds, of course, then the other person, if you speak to them gently with a good intention, but the criticism is false, then the other person will feel comfortable about correcting you and pointing out that the ground on which they're being criticized is not is not valid, not a valid one. On the other hand, if you speak to them, you say you have a mind of loving kindness, or you think you have a mind of loving kindness, your intention is to benefit them. But if you speak to them harshly, even if the criticism is true, but if you speak to them harshly at the wrong time, they're not going to accept you and respond properly to your criticism. They're not going to respond to your criticism in a way, they're not going to accept your criticism and use your criticism to change their behavior. To the contrary, sometimes they become even more obstinate, more deeply entrenched in their wrong conduct.
But Bhante, in the simile of the snake, that Bhikkhu Arita, who was propagating false dharma, the Buddha reproved him really, really strongly, and he abandoned. He reproved him in front of the whole monastic community, and made him abandon his wrong views.
Yeah, I pointed that out earlier. I said that sometimes the Buddha doesn't really follow these criteria himself. I don't know what to say about that.
Well,
but maybe that when I said that one shouldn't reprove a person when they're sitting with their friends or in a circle of other people, maybe that was my intention, my interpretation of what is the meaning of proper time and wrong time. But the Buddha, we could say, does understand, since the Buddha will know sort of all of the underlying tendencies of the person being criticized, their inclinations, their dispositions, what is going to be the consequence of his criticism. The Buddha will know the right time for criticizing the person, even if it means calling them out, calling them up in front of the entire community, and then somewhat harshly, with sometimes harsh words, criticizing them in front of the whole community.
But Bhante, please allow me to say, this is backing up my the point I made earlier, the truth. I mean, the Buddha could not let this untruth go unchallenged, and the truth was the dominant factor in that whole discussion.
Yeah,
so,
the Buddha, I think that's what I said, that the Buddha had to ensure that these wrong interpretations or wrong views were not going to be disseminated. And if he let that go, or just spoke to the person privately, after that person has already expressed his views to other members of the Sangha, then it's possible that others will pick up the wrong view of those misleading,
mistaken.
Yeah, and then spread their statements throughout the community. So in order to really to stop those misinterpretations in their tracks, the Buddha had to call them up in front of the whole Sangha and reproach them there. Yeah, there's a sutta that occurs, actually, this is quite relevant here. It's in the Majjhima Nikaya. Let me just try to think of the number. Could it be 59? Or 58 or 59? Probably 58. In which the Buddha is, the question comes up, what kind of speech the Buddha utters and what kind he doesn't utter. Let me see if I could just find it since it's relevant to this discussion. Let me just get it quickly.
It is 58, Bhante.
Wow. What is the title of it?
It's to Prince Abhaya. I just see a little bit, Venerable Sir, would it Tathagata utter such speech as would be unwelcome and disagreeable to others?
Yeah.
So it's to Prince Abhaya.
Yeah, okay, it's Abhaya Rajakumara.
Yeah.
Okay, so here we have what kind of, yeah, so this is where the Buddha has made a statement about Devadatta. That was his ambitious cousin. And he said that Devadatta is destined for rebirth in hell, that he will stay in hell for an aeon. And then Devadatta was angry and displeased with that statement of the Buddha. And so the prince, Abhaya, is questioning the Buddha about that statement. And so the Buddha is explaining the kind of speech that he utters. And so he says that speech that he knows to be false and unbeneficial, and which is disagreeable to others, he won't utter such speech because it's false, unbeneficial, and disagreeable. Okay, if the statement is true, but unbeneficial and disagreeable to others, again, he won't utter that speech, because even though it's true, it's not beneficial and it's disagreeable to others. But when we come to the speech which is true, correct, beneficial to others, and but it is unwelcome and disagreeable to others, then the Buddha will utter that speech, but he knows the right time to use such speech. And so the speech is correct, it meets that criterion, it's true, it's beneficial, it meets that criterion, but it's disagreeable to the other person. The other person doesn't like it, he's offended by it, hurt by it. Still, the Buddha will know the right time to use that speech. Okay, then there's some more. Let's see how it goes. Okay, speech the Buddha knows to be false, unbeneficial, and it's welcome and agreeable to others. He won't utter that speech because it's false and unbeneficial. Okay, then there's speech that the Buddha knows to be true, but it's unbeneficial and agreeable to others. So it meets two good criterion, but is unbeneficial. So he won't utter that speech. But there's speech that he knows to be true, to be beneficial, and it's agreeable to others. The Buddha will utter that speech at the proper time, because it said the reason he does so is because he has compassion for beings. And then he uses a simile, I think it's in this sutta. Yeah, he uses a simile to illustrate that use of the disagreeable speech. Since he's speaking to this prince, and the prince has a little son. So he says, suppose that the prince, that the little boy were to get a stick or a pebble in its mouth, what would you do? Then the prince says, I would try to take it out, and if I couldn't take it out gently, then what I would do is to hold down the head of the little boy, and I would take my hand and push it down the throat of the boy and to pull out that stick or pebble, even if it meant drawing blood. And what is the reason for that? Out of compassion for the child. And so that illustrates the Buddha's use of this disagreeable speech. The Buddha's intention is to benefit beings out of compassion for beings. And so sometimes he will speak what's disagreeable in order to change the person. Okay, but when we utter speech, we have to be a little more careful. So we have to try to make the speech, at least speak gently to make it agreeable to the person, even though sometimes the person might respond in a negative way when they're being reproached. Yeah, so that is in the middle length discourses, sutta number 58. Okay, let's just quickly try to come to the end of the sutta. There are some other patterns which I think follow quite logically. This is an important point that comes towards the end. So he says that the person who is being reproached should establish themselves in two things, in truth and non-anger. Or we could say in truth and patience. So he should think, if others reproach me, whether it's the proper time or an improper time, whether it's about what is true or what is false, I should be established in two things, in truth and non-anger or patience. So first I'd say, when you're established in patience, then when others criticize you, you listen to the criticism without letting yourself be triggered by the criticism, by start responding forcefully, angrily, reproaching the other person in turn, trying to evade the criticism. But you listen, you set up patience first in order to absorb the criticism and to keep a calm, balanced mind. And then from a position of patience, you set yourself up in truth and you try to establish if necessary, the other person in truth. That means if the criticism of the other person is true, then you accept the criticism and use it as a basis for changing your behavior. But since you have this commitment to truth, if the criticism of the other person is false or in some way distorted or based on a misperception, misrepresentation, then standing in truth, you try to correct the other person and present your perspective on the situation and try to get the other person to see things from the point of view of truth. And so the text continues, if you know there is such a criticism, such a quality within you, the quality for which you're being criticized, then you say that exists. But if that quality doesn't exist in you, then you tell the other person, it doesn't exist. It's not found in me. But then the Buddha says, even when you are speaking to them in such a way, some foolish people here won't respectfully accept what you say. Okay, let's see if there are any further questions or comments. We just have a little time. Okay, so the way to ask the question is by using the hand symbol. I see Uma de Silva.
Hello, Bhante. Thank you, Bhante. I have a question on what if you follow all 5 criteria, but then that person gets angry while you're talking to them? So does that mean it's no longer the right time?
Yeah, but you might have spoken at the right time, you found a good time, but the person gets angry anyway. Then you just have to face the fact that sometimes you can't change everybody, and the problem then rests with that person, and then you just have to accept the situation with equanimity.
Thank you, Bhante.
And there's another sutta that's relevant to this. I won't try to call it up. It's in the Majjhima Nikaya, number 103. Actually, I have the Majjhima open. Let's see if I could find it very quickly. Oops, too far. Yeah, this sutta is about conflicts that break out within the Sangha. So I think the Buddha must have spoken this close to the end of his life. So he laid down some principles for avoiding conflicts and disputes within the Sangha and sort of the guidelines to follow. And let me just get the statement that I wanted. Okay, now I have it. Okay, so he's saying it might occur to you when you speak to another person, it'll be troublesome for me, and the other person will be hurt because the other person gets angry easily and is attached to their own view. And I cannot change that person and make them abandon the unwholesome and turn to the wholesome. Then he says, in that case, you just have to look upon that person with equanimity. You can't change them, so just accept the situation.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bhante.
Okay, we're going to have to end now because I'll have to go up for the meal. And so we'll end with the first the sharing of, I'm losing my voice, the sharing of the merits. I'll do it very briefly. Akasata Chabumata Deva Naga Mahidika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirangra Kantu Sasanang. Akasata Chabumata Deva Naga Mahidika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirangra Kantu Desanang. Akasata Chabumata Deva Naga Mahidika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirangra Kantu Mang Parang Dukha Pata Chani Dukha Baya Pata Chani Baya Soka Pata Chani Soka Antu Sabepi Panino. May those in suffering be free from suffering. May those in fear be free from fear. May those in sorrow be free from sorrow. May all living beings also be thus. And then we'll end with three vows to the Buddha. And we have an actual Buddha image here. So I'm going to stand up and do the 3 bows.
Thank you, Buddha. Thank you, Buddha's teachings.
Okay, so we do 3 bows.
Yeah, so practical and truthful. I mean, most to be taken.
Okay, so thank you all for joining this morning.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you,
Bhante.
Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you.
Sadhu, sadhu.
Have a good lunch.
Thank you, Bhante. Good to have you.
Bhante.
Thank you,
Good health.
Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Sadhu,
Sadhu, sadhu.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Okay.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you,
Okay,
Bhante.
take
Have a good
care.
lunch.
night.
See you next week.
Okay, bye.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Bhante.
Okay.